caught the end of what Tom was saying there, but he raises a valid point, doesn't he, in all of this? Well, I mean, how would the Labour Party handle all of this? How would you handle the RMT? How would you handle the nurses with their 19% pay demand offers?
Well, actually, the context, I would say, is quite different in our country compared to other countries. You know, Tom said, well, all nations are facing difficult economic circumstances. Certainly all countries are impacted by the Ukraine crisis. But in our country, the impact has been more intense. That's for two reasons. First reason, we've had 12 years where our economy has not grown at the rate of many other countries. It's grown far more slowly than it did under Labour governments, for example, and people's real wages have either stagnated or they've actually gone down precipitously, right, over recent times. That's one big difference between our country and other countries under those Conservative-led governments. The second big difference is that rather than having a government that recognises its responsibility, the fact that it needs to ensure that, for example, in the NHS there is a deal because of the impact not having a deal will have on patients, instead of having a responsible government like that, the Conservative government just have not engaged. OK, there's been months and months and months when Labour has been calling on them to actually sit down with the nurses and get a resolution to this. They refuse to do that. In fact, they've only recently sat down with the Royal College of Nursing over the last 24 hours. And before they did that, they actually said they wouldn't talk about pay, for example. Now, that's not the action of a responsible government. And it's why we're seeing more industrial action in this country compared with other comparable nations. It's worse here. And I'm afraid the responsibility for that lies with the Conservatives.
GB News People's poll in the last 48 hours or so, people were very strongly supporting the strikes, which is surprising, maybe, given that it's only 9 days till Christmas and there seems to be a strike a day until then. And it's even affecting everybody's movement around the country on the railways. People are worried about needing the NHS in the next few days. And we're even worried that our Christmas cards will never get to their destination. And yet they're still supporting the strikers. Does that surprise you?
Well, ultimately, of course, strikes are only ever an indication that negotiations haven't taken place or they haven't managed to find a deal. And they are really disruptive. I mean, you just talked about some of the kinds of disruption that they cause there, but of course they also lead to workers losing a day's pay as well. So they're not undertaken lightly. And of course, the context for this is that really long period of people's real wages not increasing. And that, as I said, is why we're in a worse situation in our country under Conservative governments, which aren't taking the right approach to this, compared to in other countries.
In this very strange position, aren't we, where, you know, if you start meeting these demands, then we're going to see wage inflation. And we know inflation is the big problem here. I mean, Labour has said all through the summer, inflation's the big problem. So if you were in power now, you're not going to be dishing out, you wouldn't be dishing out the money to these people making these demands, would you?
So we'd be doing two things. First of all, we would be negotiating. That means sitting down and actually getting an agreement. When you have that kind of negotiation, tends to be the case that neither side gets exactly what they want, but there's a negotiation. That's the point of it, in order to achieve a deal which will, for example, in the NHS, work for patients and make sure that we protect the workforce, especially when we're seeing such high levels of turnover and people walking away from being nurses because they're worried about the current situation. The second thing that we do is we'd act to stabilise the economy. I mean, the Conservatives have lost control of our economy. I think that the decision yesterday around having to put up interest rates indicates that. There's a huge mortgage premium now people are paying because of Conservative mismanagement, and there's no plan for growth. You know, that's why, again, inflation is a particular problem in our country's economy, because we don't have any clear plan for growth from the Conservative government. Labour set out plans, a green prosperity plan, how we'd be growing those decently paid jobs in the new green technologies, for example, how we'd scrap business rates, how we'd get our economy on a firmer footing. But again, we've not had that from the Conservatives. So our economy is not stabilising in the way that it should be at the moment. Labour would deliver that.
Sadly, Anneliese Dodds.